Welcome to the On the Road with Al and Ivy podcast with your host, Al Handa, and featuring the music of Handa-McGraw International and the solo work of Mark McGraw. The Life of Joan of Arc by Anatole France. One of the most polarizing figures in Western history is the woman known as Jeanne, or Joan of Arc. She's also one of the most well-known figures in history, and in France she's a national hero, and to the Catholic Church a saint. Two of the main reasons that some critics cite to marginalize or diminish her life is one, she was considered insane or deluded by modern standards, and two, some have considered her merely a puppet who was manipulated by France's military generals and nobles of the era. It's not a stretch to also note that many of her modern admirers tend to be women. A great number of female authors and writers have written about Jeanne and see her as a heroic or inspirational figure. As far as Jeanne being deluded or insane, it must be remembered that she was captured by the English and tried by their French sympathizers, which included politicians, clergymen, and other learned figures in a tribunal that tried her as a witch and as a woman who wore women's clothes and burned her at the stake. It wouldn't be exactly clear who was the insane ones in that scenario. One of the most well-known biographies was written in 1908 by a French writer who was one of the foremost satirical writers of his era, and for that reason it's an interesting study of this remarkable young woman. Francois Anatole Thibault, who wrote under the pen name Anatole France, was a Nobel Prize-winning French poet and writer who wrote a 2-volume biography of Joan of Arc. George Orwell later described the work as showing that Jeanne or Joan was a lunatic, which was his interpretation, not France's. France did speculate that Jeanne may have suffered from delusions caused by frequent fasting, though. The books are a detailed collection of facts, historical legends, opinions, and just as interesting, his questions. The Life of Joan of Arc reads like an old history book. It doesn't have the flow of a modern novel, and because it's a translated work from the original French, it may have lost some subtleties like humor and satire. The book's overall feel is, for the lack of a better word, kind to Jeanne's story, and the occasional insertion of author comments and criticism feels jarring like a sudden shift in tone. It probably read differently in the original French. One of the reasons that Jeanne was considered by some modern experts to be mentally ill was that she claimed to hear the voices of Saint Margaret, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and occasionally the angel Michael, which are woven into the story. That creates an atmosphere where the protagonists appear to float in and out of reality, but it feels accurate for the era when visions weren't necessarily considered fantasy or neuroses. What makes the book worthwhile is that while Anatole is a skeptic, he does give Jeanne a fair shake. One feels while reading his account that he admired her, implying that even if she was manipulated, there was no guile or manipulation on her part. All of the major events in her life are covered in detail, her statements are delivered straight, and her piety is described without judgment. The reader will see all the viewpoints surrounding this ultimately remarkable woman. Anatole's book makes clear that she had plenty of detractors, particularly among the English who occupied parts of France, and some of the French generals, but he doesn't spare them either. During the 100 Years' War, France was a sprawling mess of small provinces ruled by lords that the king couldn't control, and whose soldiers were as likely to rob and pillage their villagers as the English. The politics and religion of the time were corrupt and infested with scoundrels with fake piety and devotion to the one true God of cash. Jeanne was a young woman the clergy had verified as pious, sincere, and possibly the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy, and she probably struck the common people as a breath of fresh air from the politics of that era. The actual historical data isn't comprehensive. In fact, it's not even clear what she looked like. Many people based their opinions of her on the remarkably detailed transcripts of her trial after she was captured and turned over to the English by Frenchmen who weren't loyal to the king. And it should be noted that His Highness made no attempt to rescue or ransom her. One problem with any historical data, beyond whether it's accurate or not, is that it often means nothing by itself. Information can end up being cherry-picked or packaged to back up a conclusion, like those modern studies that attempt to diagnose her mental condition from historical accounts. Clearly, Jeanne became a living symbol that various people and factions embraced or attacked depending on their own agendas. That's led to modern opinions that reveal more about the writer and their motives than the subject. One opinion I've read speculates that she was a naive stooge, used and manipulated by powerful nobles and generals, which actually shows more of the writer's reluctance to believe that a young woman could achieve something that great, and also believing that noblemen were all chivalrous and competent. Her rise and fall certainly involved more than one single factor. One crucial point that Anatole makes is that in the events leading up to Jean's first and probably most significant victory at Orleans, the inhabitants of that city welcomed her because of a deep distrust of the French nobility, who were just as likely to plunder the city as the English were. The military situation in Orleans was that the English, called Godons because they used the word goddamn a lot, didn't have enough men to seal the city off entirely. So the problem was that the population could defend the city walls and had more supplies than the enemy, but not enough strength to attack armored knights in the open and drive them away. In other words, if the English couldn't be driven away, they could eventually gather enough men to cut the city off completely. However, that wasn't a given, as the shortage of supplies drove the English to mount desperate attacks to try and bring things to a quick conclusion. One solution for the town was to ask the French king for help, but that could require a hefty payment that might simply whet the appetite of the noble banditry of France, and after victory they would have to deal with their rescuers. It was a classic political situation where each solution was a little worse than the other. Aside from the atrocities that the English victory would bring, it's also clear that France, as it existed then, wasn't really in danger of being wholly conquered. The country was simply too large for any English army to take. The 100 Years' War was essentially a series of glorified raids by the English where some territory changed hands, and the massive defeats of French armies were followed by payments and concessions that left the country intact. The fact that the people of Orleans didn't regard getting aid from the king as the default solution shows that the English weren't necessarily viewed as the ultimate threat to national survival. That's just a simple overview, of course. One can get into more detail about that age, which would open the door for a multitude of theories and opinions. The key point is that the myth or leadership of Joan of Arc inspired France's commoners and middle class to unite and fight at a time when the nobles were having a difficult time even finding soldiers. The people of Orleans were probably relieved to find a hero who would keep the French nobles in check. Joan of Arc, or her image, was a unifier, and it did bring about the defeat of the English at Orleans and elsewhere. Her piety must have been honest and inspiring, because in that age, she'd have been tried and executed for witchcraft or heresy long before she had picked up the banner for France. Anatole France's biography, as stated earlier, was written by a skeptic, but like many of the learned religious figures back then, he could find little wrong with the person. Like Sitting Bull or Hannibal, whose histories were largely written by their enemies, it says a lot about historical figures when their character survives attack. Anatole France could find no hard proof of insanity, and centuries of modern cynicism haven't produced convincing evidence that she was a mere figurehead for men, unless you're predisposed to assume men are always the real power. In spite of attempts to destroy her myth and legend, and not being judged by the same criteria as a man, it can be said that she saved France from the English invaders and became a national hero and saint who still inspires men and women to this day. You can find this public domain book for free on the Project Gutenberg site and other websites. It's still considered one of the best biographies, so it's worth reading if you're interested. You've been listening to On the Road with Al and I, a collection of literary essays, classic book talk, and humor from the works of Al Handa on Bella, X, and Kindle Unlimited. This closed with some music by Handa-McGraw. Thank you for listening.